So good evening to everybody. I'm so happy that we are back to our anti-racism speaker series. This is for the Master of Educational Technology program at UBC, and we are pleased to be offering another year. We started it last year and started this next year with these incredibly dynamic and diverse speakers. So please note that this presentation is being recorded, and if you do not wish that your name or face be seen on the screen, please make sure that you either rename yourself or take your camera off if you wish. My name is Dr. Carrie Ewert. I am the coordinator for Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Outreach, and a lecturer for the Master of Educational Technology program, what we call here MET at UBC, and one of the designers of the Anti-Racism Speaker Series, along with Dr. Samia Khan, who I will introduce at this point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ewert. I am Dr. Samia Khan, formerly the director of the MET program and associate professor in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy in the Faculty of Education. I'm also the co-coordinator with Dr. Carrie Ewert of the seminar series. I would like to acknowledge that today I am speaking on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. Master of Educational Technology offices and our people are located on this territory. This week, I learned more about the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. I listened to interviews with local Indigenous people, read more about our colonial history in this land, and had questions about the role of government in decolonization. We at MET are committed to joining our university community in much needed dialogue about institutional efforts to change. Towards this, MET has developed a vision statement for the future about our work, and we have launched this series on anti-racism that calls for action.
Thank you very much, Samia. Now, just briefly to give you an overview, the Master of Educational Technology program is a graduate studies program in the Faculty of Education at UBC that educates professionals on the use and impact of digital learning technologies. And the purpose of this speaker series is to acknowledge the commitment that every individual has to inclusivity and to addressing systemic racism in multiple capacities. So looking at it as it exists across sectors, looking at anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, anti-people of color, and races, we really want to intersect and examine the different facets that affect racism and what we can do as a community to build and support anti-racist approaches and strategies within our practice. To enhance, we want to transform all different learning environments and learning cultures. So with specific directive being digital technologies, our presenters will discuss racism and strategies and tools to support that equity, diversity, inclusion, decolonization, and anti-racism, really in the changing dynamics of our world. So with that, and something very different as part of this series is we do have a call to action. And the call to action is really investigating how we as audience members can take the content that's being presented to us and put it into action. So often we go to these amazing presentations, we hear these mind-blowing things that we want to enact and we really want to move forward, but then we stop at that. We might have a conversation here and there. What we're asking you to do is to take action, whether it be to facilitate your own conversations and discussions around Sing's presentation and content today, whether it be to create a workshop, whether it be to create a lesson, for instance, that you might integrate into your own practice, some way that you could move this talk to action. And we'll speak about this a little bit further at the end of the presentation.
I'd like to go ahead, thank you very much, and introduce our Parliamentary Secretary, Rachna Singh. It's my great pleasure to introduce our Parliamentary Secretary elected as the MLA for Surrey Green Timbers in May 2017. Parliamentary Secretary Singh was the convener of the Special Committee to appoint a Police Complaint Commissioner and the Special Committee to appoint a Conflict of Interest Commissioner. Rachna Singh has worked as a drug and alcohol counselor, a support worker for women facing domestic violence, and a community activist. She has also worked to improve workers' rights as a representative with the Canadian Union of Public Employees. Rachna Singh is our first Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism Initiatives. She tabled the Anti-Racism Data Act in BC. We are very excited and looking forward to your presentation on anti-racist data collection and the use of data to inform policy and service delivery. Welcome, Parliamentary Secretary Singh.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khan and Dr. Everett. It is such an honor to be here, and I really, when we got the invite to speak on these anti-racism speaker series, the staff and myself, we were really excited about this. And before I start, I really want to first of all acknowledge that I'm joining you from the shared territories of the Semiahmoo, Getsy, Kwikwetlam, Kwantlen, Kikite, and Swasan First Nations. And I also would like to acknowledge the great work that UBC is doing, the anti-racism work, and especially in the beginning when you were talking about the work that is happening in your department in educating people about the anti-racism, and especially the focus on the action plan. I think that is extremely important. Dr. Khan, you just mentioned that I'm the first ever Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism, and I'll just take a minute to just explain that, because I take a big honor of the fact that I am the first ever Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism. This position used to be called Parliamentary Secretary for Multiculturalism. So the shift from multiculturalism to anti-racism, I think that is a very significant one. And that is something that we are seeing happening in different bodies. The government definitely, but the use of the word anti-racism, giving it more significance and doing the more challenging work. I think with multiculturalism, we have been able to achieve a lot. I love it when festivals like Diwali, Eid, Lunar New Year, all those are celebrated. I love it when the food is celebrated, our diversity is celebrated. It is just amazing. But when it comes to talk about the anti-racism, it is more challenging, it is more difficult, and it is very uncomfortable. Even people like a lot of times they feel, a lot of people say that it is difficult for the majority of the community, but it is, I would say, as a racialized person myself, it is a difficult word, especially when we are talking about our own experiences. It's a very, very difficult to talk about racism, especially the experiences that we have had. So I'm extremely honored to be appointed as the first time ever Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism by Premier Horgan. And today I'm here to speak about our critical legislation that the province is working on. When I first got my mandate letter that Premier Horgan gave me, he asked me to work on two key mandates, two key legislation. And the first one was the anti-racism data legislation. And the second one is the broader Anti-Racism Act. So I was very, very, I think it was a proud moment definitely for myself, for my staff, for us at the government, that when on June 2nd, 2022, the Anti-Racism Data Act became law in British Columbia. This act will support government to dismantle systemic racism by enabling the collection and use of information to help identify hidden racial inequalities in government services and programs to lead to a more just and equitable province. With this information, government can better meet the needs of Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities. We all know that that systemic racism happens Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities, and they have inequitable access to certain government programs and services, or they have worse outcomes than British Columbians overall when they access them. Although sometimes we know that this discrimination may not be intentional, it is a systemic problem that we need to understand and recognize so that we can fix it. As the Parliamentary Secretary, I have been working with the Multiculturalism and Anti-Racism branch in the Ministry of Attorney General and with the Ministry of Citizen Services BC's Human Rights Commissioner, First Nations and Métis leadership, racialized communities, and other British Columbians to introduce a system to securely collect and safely analyze demographic information on race, ethnicity, faith, gender, sex, ability, income, and other social identity markers. Collecting and using this data in the right way can help us show where there are systemic inequalities so that we can address the issues of discrimination, inequalities, and gaps in services. When we were doing the consultation for this Data Act, one thing that we heard a lot from the communities was the privacy. And so the protecting people's privacy and keeping this information safe is our highest priority. By collecting this important and critical statistical information, we can make sure that government services are delivered equitably and meet the needs of all people in British Columbia. It also means that communities have the essential information to advocate for the changes that will make a real difference. This is one of the first pieces of new legislation to be co-developed with the Indigenous people under the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Through our engagement and consultations with racialized communities and Indigenous leaders, we heard strong support for the anti-racism focus of this legislation. The consultations, which I'm very proud to say, one of the most extensive consultations happened before this act became a law. That included direct community engagement and First Nation leaders' feedback, which helped shape the anti-racism data legislation and its implementation. And it ensures that it is reflective of the needs and experiences of racialized communities. The PC Human Rights Commissioner issued a report in 2020 called Disaggregated Demographic Data Collection in British Columbia, the Grandmother's Perspective, which was also the foundational to the development of this legislation. The concept of community harms, which was outlined in the Grandmother Perspective report, was kept top of mind in drafting this legislation. You will also notice this concept is woven throughout the legislation to ensure that the real risks of racism, prejudice, stereotyping, bias, stigmatization that can occur through the collection, use, and disclosure of data are identified, prevented, mitigated, and minimized. The intention with this legislation has been to do no harm and cause no interference in Indigenous people's work, and especially their right to data self-governance. In fact, we see this legislation as an important first step in getting there. We respect that First Nations are moving forward, self-governing, community-driven, and nation-based data model with the rights to define and to own, control, access, and possess information about their people and their communities. It is our hope that this legislation will pave the way for the analysis of intersectional data, identify and eliminate systemic racism, and advance racial equity across the public sector. Our goal has been to align this legislation with the Declaration Act and to make it broadly enabling. We heard the plight of Indigenous and racialized communities asking the province to improve the collection, use, and access to race-based data for a long time. And we have been made aware that with better race-based data, Indigenous and racialized communities can also understand their community members' experiences with public services, such as education, healthcare, housing, and policing, so that systemic racism can be identified and addressed. This legislation was needed to ensure that the data collected, stored, and used is done safely in a way that does not cause any harm to the communities that we are trying to help. This legislation will also serve as a critical tool that will give the BC government, First Nations, and racialized communities better information to drive action and change. We are working in the government across all sectors to support a coordinated approach to collecting data. This will mean delaying any new surveys that will collect race-based data to use the data that will be collected by the population survey from BC Stats in November of 2022. In advance of demographic data provided by the survey, the government is also reviewing how programs may be perpetuating or reinforcing systemic barriers in the following ways. By looking at any previous research, data, or evaluations that have been done from anti-racist lens, identifying the challenges or services gap in hope to solve by reviewing policies, procedures, and practices from an anti-racist lens, and also beginning to plan for future research projects for which the survey data will be available in the Data Innovation Program in spring of 2023, and that can be linked to the program level data. Under the Anti-Racism Data Act, the province created a provincial anti-racism data committee, which will bring together community members to collaborate with government to determine key research priorities and how to use data safely to identify and dismantle systemic racism in public sector. During the Anti-Racism Data Act engagement, we heard from the Indigenous peoples and racialized communities that government should prioritize using data to address systemic racism in education, health, and policing. And we are expecting that this is where we will need to focus our efforts first. The province will also deliver a population survey in November of 2022, which will be administered by BC Stats to begin the collection of key demographic information and further consult on demographic categories related to race, ethnicity, ancestry, and others to better understand what aspects of people's identities matter to how government sees and serves them. This approach aligns with feedback from Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities who called on government to take a coordinated approach to collect data, not asked to provide this information multiple times, which can obviously cause repeat trauma. Additionally, the province will begin working directly with the BC First Nations and Métis Nation BC to prioritize research priorities as well as data standards and guidelines needed to implement the Anti-Racism Data Act in a way that is culturally safe, it doesn't harm the communities, and aligns with the Declaration Act. These standards and guidelines, along with the statistics, including from the population survey, will be released in the summer of 2023. The province will continue to work with the Indigenous peoples, the committee, and the racialized communities on how statistical information can be collected and used in ways that are culturally safe and do not harm communities. In closing, I would like to reiterate that this is one of the first new major pieces of legislation that has been introduced since the Declaration Act was passed. And one thing that I always say that governments have a moral and ethical responsibility to tackle racism, but we won't be able to do this work without our strong allies. And I'm so thankful to UBC and to all of you to be key listeners, but also strong allies in our work. And I'm really looking forward to hear from you to any feedback that you have for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It seems amazing in the way that you have reflected and identified how different groups' voices and honoring those voices within this data collection is available. I know that we have a Slido that is up, and the Slido is a means for people to ask questions, and we already have a couple of questions for you that have been posted. So Dr. Khan, do you have access to the Slido? Did you want to read out the questions that are there?
Certainly I can. Thank you very much. We have several questions for you and more that are popping up on our Slido, giving people a chance to ask their questions through this mechanism, and the link is in the chat. Our first question is, what ideas do you have on decentering whiteness through data and in research?
So all the work that we are doing is obviously talking about the, although we don't say it, we don't name it as such, but talking about the white privilege, how to acknowledge that, and be cautious of that, right? So this work, I think that we have started with this legislation, the commitment of the government on when we are talking about, when I first started, like our commitment to move from the multiculturalism to anti-racism. We are trying to say that the majority of the population, the white population, they need to understand what the communities are going through. What are the issues that are facing those communities? What are the barriers, the gaps those communities are facing? And to take it from there, bringing out the resources so that we are making, when we talk about this province, when we say that everybody has equal access in this province, it is very easy to say that in theory, but practically what we are doing to make it as equitable as possible. And that's what this data legislation is the first step towards that. I know in the real world, it is not an easy solution to or easy work for any one of us, anybody who's doing this work. But I am very proud to say that we are addressing it, we are naming it when it comes to it. A lot of times people don't use the terms. I think it's important to use the terms like white supremacy, like white privilege, like anti-racism, and bringing and having the collaborators, having the strong allies that I talked about, and doing this work. This is not a work that will be done just with this one legislation. We know that. It is a process. It is a path that we have taken, and so glad to be doing it. But at the same time, know about the challenges that we have. Would love to hear from you as well, like how we can better shape this work. How can we do it even in a better way? So looking for those feedback from you as well.
Thank you. And now to our next question. Will racial categories follow Stats Canada census categories? How could categories be updated while staying coherent with federal data sets?
So the team at the Citizen Services, the team that we are collaborating with for this Data Act, they are the data people. They know exactly the terms and the categories that are being used in the Stats Canada, BC Stats, all those. But at the same time, we are updating those categories. When we introduced our survey, the first time ever, the survey had the categories that were never used before. The categories about the one category that comes to my mind is the visible markers of your identity, like what are you wearing? For example, if you are wearing a turban, you are wearing a hijab, you're wearing a kippah. So this was the first time ever that we used that in our survey. That was the initial survey that started before the consultations happened. And I think that was, we got really, really good feedback when we used those kind of identity markers. And the staff at the Citizen Services, as well as the staff within the anti-racism branch, are very cognizant of the facts that like there are different identity markers that people identify with, and it's important to include that in our in any kind of survey that we would be introducing. So that's even before we send out our population survey, we are reaching out to the communities themselves, the Indigenous, Black, and the racialized communities, like how they would like to shape that population survey as well. So the consultations do not finish as we have the Anti-Racism Data Act, but the consultations and their collaboration of those communities would be, I think, would be key in any kind of survey or any kind of interaction, any kind of that we bring forward. And I think that is the key to this legislation, that it is for the people and it is by the people. Any kind of feedback they give us to be included in that survey, that would be considered.
Thank you for that comprehensive response. What are your suggestions for allyship and the work to be done as allies to disseminate this systemic racism?
I think that is the key to this work. As I mentioned in the very beginning, this is a very critical work. It is very challenging work. It is difficult work, and it's not easy. It is not easy on anybody. It is governments obviously should be taking the concrete steps towards it, but cannot do it without our allies. And um, it is a lot of times when people say like how to be an ally, and it can mean different things to different in different settings for different people. We also had within our government we had a campaign called no longer a bystander. Like you have to intervene when you see any kind of racist incident happening. You should intervene in your best capacity, keeping your safety obviously as a priority, but how to intervene. But for institutions, for organizations, education is the key, like what you are doing here, having these kind of speaker series. I think this is very important. Having education awareness. If somebody you think is saying something inappropriate, try to intervene. A lot of times we stay quiet because we don't want to create any ripples, or we don't want to be considered as somebody who's rude. I think when you are trying to be anti-racist, it is little difficult, but it is the right thing to do. And the more awareness, more education that you can bring, whether it is in your organization or in your family setting, I think that will help us creating that allyship and making this work feasible. I think making this challenging work more easy for everybody to do. So allyship is important, and we can. There are different ways to be an ally, which we can obviously talk in more detail if required.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about the next question. You've discussed safety. How do we avoid the misuse of granular data, say in school completion rates, to stigmatize specific groups?
Because that was the, as I mentioned in my presentation as well, that was the key. We have known historically, whenever the data was collected, it has further marginalized the communities that it was meant to support. And that was the key to this legislation, that no community harm should come out of this legislation. And that's why all the factors about how we are collecting it, how we are storing it, how we are analyzing it, and how we are dispensing that information is very important. And I'm very, very happy to have the support of our data experts in the citizen services. They are the people who know how to keep data safe, how to collect it safely. So we at the anti-racism branch, like we are a lot of passionate people who know so much about anti-racism, and but like they are the data people who know how to do it. So all those factors, everything that needs to be done to protect the communities, that they should not be further marginalized, not further stigmatized, are kept into, I think that is the foundation of this legislation. So as we roll out our work, like you will see it with our population survey, and then also when we release our first report in summer of 2023, you will see all those aspects of the no community harm being the foundation of this legislation.
We've heard about the good work of the government and your office in terms of this legislation, but is society ready to not essentialize coincidence with negative outcomes as traits of that group?
I honestly, I know there were a lot of fears about this legislation, and that's why this, when we were starting the work, even before we started our consultations, our formal consultations, like we met with the indigenous communities leaders leaders, First Nation leaders. We met with the our partners within the racialized communities, with the Métis Nation BC, having like extensive consultations. One thing that we heard from them was nothing about us without us, right? So, and that has been the focus of this legislation. For the first time ever, we had the most extensive consultations, whether you look at our survey, whether you look at the consultations that were led by the First Nations, that were led by the community organizations. They did not want the government to come and do those consultations on their behalf. These consultations were done by the communities, and all the feedback that we got from those consultations, that was the foundational and that helped us draft this legislation. First time ever a legislation co-drafted by our First Nation and indigenous partners. I think, and that consultation and that collaboration won't stop. It hasn't stopped since we introduced the legislation, since the legislation became an act. It will continue. Even right now, we are in talks with the communities to see how to do the population survey, what to include in that survey, so that they have that trust in us, because that trust was, we know, with all that has happened, the trauma that those communities have gone through, the trust was broken. And so it is important to build that trust and retain that trust. I think that is very, very important for us as government and myself personally as a parliamentary secretary. So really looking forward to this work, and so happy for the collaboration, the partnership that we are having with the communities.
We have some more questions. Thank you for mentioning the work with Indigenous peoples on co-drafting legislation. And we know that BC is one of several provinces that have enacted similar anti-racist legislation. Is there coordination with any federal initiatives on data records? How do we de-risk getting ahead of the federal government?
So not so much with the federal government, but definitely we were in the staff, we looked at the Anti-Racism Act from Ontario. They focused on the data piece in their Anti-Racism Act. We looked at that thoroughly. The staff were in talks with them. As far as the federal part is gone, I don't have much information. Maybe if my staff would have better information about that. My understanding is, and I might be wrong, that they don't have any federal anti-racism data strategy, as far as I know, but I don't have all the information. I might be wrong here, but we have consulted with other jurisdictions that had it, like Ontario, and I understand Nova Scotia just had their own Anti-Racism Act that came out in spring of 2022. So those are the jurisdictions that we talked with. We also consulted, the staff also talked to and consulted with the jurisdictions outside of Canada. I know they were in touch with the jurisdiction from United Kingdom and Australia, because they have the similar acts. So that they were also consulted and talked to, but where the federal government is concerned, I don't have much information whether we have done anything with them.
Thank you for your response to that. Our next question asks about, you mentioned the use of ethnic markers in surveys. Do you think that change of name could also be a significant marker of tackling racial discrimination?
So changing the name to the from ethnic markers to something else, that's what you mean?
I'd like to ask the person who posted that question to offer a response to Parliamentary Secretary Singh's question.
Basically, hi, I'm Parul. So basically, we know that people tend to change their names from, let's say, like I'm an Indian and I have a difficult name, and I might just want to change my name to, let's say, if I was let's say to Pearl, right? Instead of being Parul. So could that be a marker of nervousness towards racial discrimination?
Definitely, Parul, you bring a very valid point. We obviously, in ideal society, nobody should be changing their name, but we know that has happened historically. A lot of people, I know how many Harrys and Garys we have within our South Asian community also, because they changed their names from their traditional names to something that was much more acceptable in the society. I think this is an important point. Like, this is a marker, and um, as you have brought up, like, this was never brought to us before, but I think it is a very, very significant one for us to consider, and I will definitely pass it on to the staff.
Thank you for your follow-up question regarding that changing of name. As I drive across the city of Vancouver, I see signs about the Japanese beetle. Is this not xenophobic?
We've had a number of, on a separate note, I would like to say, we've had a number of consultations with the Japanese community on a different issue. Like, if you remember, in May of this year, we recognized, especially the province acknowledged the what had happened to the Japanese community, especially the internment and the trauma that the community has faced. Just before that, for a whole year, we were in consultations with the Japanese community, talking about different areas that that the government should be addressing and should be focusing on. This one never came up there. Japanese beetle, like in my conversations with them, it never came up. They never showed any kind of. They did not say that this is problematic for them. So I would really like to go back to the community again and find out, like, how they feel about it, because this is something, like, if the community is not feeling safe about it or they're not feeling comfortable about it, I would definitely, it's something that the government would consider.
Thank you. Our next question is, what are the purposes of asking about family of origin? For example, where are your grandparents from, and its utility for data collection?
That is, a lot of times, I think it is, this is a question that is asked to people number of times. Like, I'll just give an example, like my son who's born here, who considers himself as Canadian. But a lot of times, like, people would ask him, where are you from? And so having that, how, just to see where the roots are of that communities are. I consider myself as South Asian. South Asians started coming here more than 100 years ago. A lot of people have never gone to India, but they have their roots and their ancestry attached to that region. I think that is important. I feel that is important to know, like, what where the roots of those communities are, and how it is becoming as a just that identity, how it is becoming as an how it is oppressing those communities. Like, those are just like one way to understand, like, where that oppression is coming from, and to, first of all, to identify that, and then to put in the processes within our systems, so that cannot be a factor that can bring the barriers or the gaps for the services that you are getting. That's how I see it, but would love to hear from you. Like, if you feel that something different, I would love to hear from you.
Thank you for offering that. Another question is, what are you finding to be your greatest barriers to the work that you're doing?
My greatest barrier, I think, and anybody who's doing the anti-racism work, this is difficult work. A lot of time people don't, especially people who have not experienced it, people who have not lived it, they don't see it as a big problem. When we use, a lot of times it has happened with me, I go to a room full of people and I'm giving a presentation about the barriers or the gaps that the communities are facing, and people are looking blankly at me as if I'm making up things. And and I am talking from a position of privilege as an elected official, as a parliamentary secretary. I'm talking about, I can't even imagine like what a common person who goes through these um, experiences every day, how they feel about it. So these are the barriers. These are, and I would say the government is not immune to that. We have, Victoria is a very elitist, I would say, a very elitist place. It's very white still. The government, the public service is very white, with a lot of people not having any kind of idea like what this work really means and how important it is. So I think the biggest barrier that I first faced when I was appointed as a parliamentary secretary, making those people realize that how important this work is and why we need to do this. Getting this legislation out was not easy. There were a lot of systemic hurdles, and I wouldn't have been able to do it without without very, very strong allies that I had within the government. So that's why when I put the importance on the allyship, I have seen it firsthand. Like I couldn't have done this work without. Now he's the ex-minister, but at that time minister responsible for this legislation, David Eby, a white privileged man, but without his support, I wouldn't have been able to do this. So these are the barriers I think that we are facing. I am really hoping as I continue this work that these systemic hurdles become less. They are much less complicated. I'm really hoping for that day when it is easier for me to do it, but it is still a big challenge.
All right, we have another question for you. What is the significance of the multiculturalism shift that you mentioned to anti-racism in your point of view?
I think it is extremely significant, and I know a lot of times there's a resistance. Even now, there's a resistance. Like a lot of people ask me, why not multiculturalism? Or why anti-racism? And a lot of times people feel that as if we are degrading multiculturalism, or we are not giving it the due importance to multiculturalism, whereas that is not what the intent is. As a racialized person, I love like what we have been able to achieve in multiculturalism, but it is important to tackle the real work as well, the challenging work. And that is what the anti-racism work is. It is very difficult, but it is like concrete, significant changes that we need to bring in our systems. The barriers, the gaps that the communities are facing are real. And talking about it, naming it, and saying it, that we are doing the concrete work toward anti-racism is extremely important. Even now, even when we were doing this legislation, there was a lot of resistance from not from the communities, but a lot of resistance sometimes from the people who are doing the legislation, that why name it anti-racism? And what we heard from the communities that they wanted the focus on anti-racism. They didn't want it to be named anything else. They wanted it to be named anti-racism. They want to use stuff to make this word easier to use so that it is in our everyday vocabulary, that people are using it every day. they said it to me that if we cannot even use the word, how can we even work on it? How can we even think of bringing the change that we are planning to bring if we are not even using the word? So I think the shift is very significant. Much more needs to be done. And just naming it is not enough, but the concrete steps that we have to take to bring in that change are extremely important.
Thank you. And there's a final comment by one of our participants. It is clear that the government is cognizant of the harm that exists. And I genuinely appreciate, as a person of color, that you are giving a voice to all people. And I would echo that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Much.
Really honored.
Now, this has been an exceptional presentation. And as a white woman and coordinator for the anti-racism speaker series for equity diversity work, I am working on my own narrative in being an ally and really working amongst and within different communities to promote that allyship. And I think you spoke brilliantly about the importance of that work and how we each have a part. And it's so significant, the work that's being done at the government level, because it filters into every other sector, with education and what we're doing, with healthcare, with with our corporate environments. So the more that we can do, the more we can talk about this. This is the important work, and this is moving that talk, as we discussed, to action. And I would like to just share this once more in the importance of this call to action and what we're asking all of our participants. And we're so privileged to have had you and to have heard from you, and really from the onset of what you've been doing and how you're planning on initiating each of these challenges, these barriers, and really addressing the systemic racism. So we ask our participants and those that will be watching, I know, this series in collaboration with their classes that they're doing, as well as onward, is that we're asking, how would you continue to support the work that is being done right now and initiated by the government, from this data collection, by investigating that data, by researching? How could we move this forward? So thinking about your own practice, what you're doing, thinking about the way that you're going to get this noticed and recognized by other people, and how you both could be an ally, as well as pushing this forward, if from a marginalized and oppressed state and community as well. So thank you so much. This was incredible.
No, thank you to you. I'm really, really honored to be here. So thank you for giving me that opportunity.
And I would also like to thank, and it is in the chat area, Edith Lando. It is a digital learning resource and site that really promotes the work of rural and Indigenous and all of our sort of marginalized and oppressed. And they continue to help support this series as well as the presenters. So we really appreciate that as well. Very briefly before we give our final goodbyes, and what I did is I recorded all the questions so I can share them with you, so that you can take them back to your team and recognize how much amazing content as well as discussion was generated just through your talk. So I will be sharing those with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now, Samia, I'm going to invite you just briefly, if you would mind, speaking to our next month's speaker.
Thank you. Met continues their anti-racism speaker series, which began last year, next month, where we welcome Dr. Zoe Brannigan-Pipe, who will be speaking on inclusive makerspaces and 21st century educational technology. Dr. Brannigan-Pipe is a teacher education accreditation coordinator, writer, and course reviewer at Brock University. Zoe is known for her creative classroom instruction methods, which support an environment that is inclusive and safe and encourages others to take risks. Zoe blogs, tweets, and uses YouTube to discuss equity, social justice, and community matters. She's presently a full-time teacher for the Gifted program at the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board in Ontario, where she has received the Profiling of Excellence Award for Innovation and Creativity. We hope you can join us right back here again on October 19th from 4 to 5 p.m. for this presentation. We're sharing the link right now in the chat for you to register for this event.
And as I'm sure your colleague that you work with, we are also going to be looking at our Human Rights Commissioner, Kasari Govinder, who will be presenting in November 24th from 5 to 6, and really looking at, again, the systemic racism that exists in policymaking, really looking at the Indigenous, our Black people in British Columbia, and those that are sincerely affected. So it will be an amazing continuation of today's talk. And moving forward. And I know that you've referenced several times the Human Rights Commissioner. So it's amazing the alignment and how closely each of the departments and divisions are working to really push this forward so that we can move to action. So we have had incredible questions, and keep asking these questions. Talk to your colleagues, speak to each other, share these ideas for the students that I see here within your classes, because this is how we continue to become allies and to get this work out there. So on behalf of MET, the Master of Educational Technology program at UBC, we want to thank you so much, Parliamentary Secretary Rachna Singh, for your incredible talk. It was thought-provoking, it was timely, it was adaptive in what is currently needed right now. And I think it helps us to really generate this important dialogue that needs to be discussed.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank you to all of our attendees. And then for those who will be watching the video afterwards, we very much appreciate your commitment to helping disseminate systemic racism.